Holy City Center Radio. It is episode 148, and I am your host, Christian Sanger. Today is Wednesday, July 19th, 2023. Smack dab in the middle of July. I hope this week is going well for you so far and ends on a high note. We're at the halfway point, basically, so we're getting close to the weekend. Remember, if you need plans, whether it's for the weekend or any random day, go to holycitycenter.com/events and see what is going on in town. Also, if you need your local news fix in between podcasts, just go to the website as well, holycitycenter.com. You can see what is going on in town. And of course, all over social media, you can get updates there as well. Speaking of staying up to date, we're going to dive into the stories. Not a whole lot going on around here, so I don't have any fun personal stories or boring personal stories, as it may be, to share today. So we're just going to get right into the news. First up, not exactly an update on the Murdaugh murder trial, or revolving around that, but it is a Murdaugh related story. This has to do with a lawsuit that was filed against Parker's, which is like a convenience store, gas station type chain, in multiple locations, including here in South Carolina. They were being sued by the family of Mallory Beach, and a settlement was reached. An attorney for the family of Mallory Beach confirmed that a settlement for $15 million has been reached with Parker's Kitchen, the convenience store, which is owned by Greg Parker. And the settlement was in relation to the 2019 boat wreck that ultimately ended with Beach dying after the boat crashed. The settlement, according to the Beach family's lawyer, represents a level of accountability that they say will hopefully cause others to take notice and become more serious about not contributing to underage drinking. Parker's attorney released a statement saying that it was, quote, disappointing, end quote, that details of the settlement were disclosed, and indicated that the parties had previously agreed to confidentiality during the mediation agreement that led to the settlement. So they were a little upset that those details leaked to the press. The lawsuit had been scheduled for a jury trial that would have began on August 14th in Hampton County, but because the settlement was reached first, the trial will not happen. So for those who may not know this part of the story, Mallory Beach died in February 2019 after a boat that she was in crashed in Beaufort County. She was thrown overboard in that collision, which happened. It was a collision with a bridge, or more accurately, I guess, a bridge piling, one of the pieces of the bridge itself that's in the water. And this accident happened after a night of partying. There were 5 other friends that were also involved in the partying and on the boat. Others had testified that Paul Murdaugh, son of convicted murderer Alec Murdaugh, was the one driving the boat. Now, at the time, Alec was known as a prominent South Carolina lawyer. Some of the details about him, whether they were rumors or some that turned out to be true, as far as stealing money from some of his clients. And of course, the double murder itself had not happened yet. So it was a little bit shocking for some people in that area who knew the family. And as people who may have looked into this, the murder trial, there's a lot of tie-ins, that this whole boat crash and the lawsuits and the criminal trial that Paul was going to be facing may have led in part to his father deciding to murder him, as well as his mother, Alec's wife, Maggie Burdock. So in any event, that's a little bit of the background. Now, the Beach family ended up suing Alec Murdaugh as well for the wrongful death, because they claimed that Alec and Maggie had supported and funded Paul's underage drinking for years and knowingly allowed Paul, who was only 19 at the time of the accident, to drunkenly operate the family's boat the night of the crash. Paul reportedly used his mother's credit card and his older brother Buster's driver's license to illegally purchase alcohol when he was underage from a Parker store in the town of Okatee. And this happened just hours before the boat crash on February 23rd of 2019. The Beach family also sued Greg Parker, the aforementioned owner of Parker's Kitchens, and the company itself for what they said was contributing to Mallory's death. The Beaches argued that a Parker's employee who sold the alcohol to Paul did not do her due diligence to confirm Paul's age and identity. If she had, they allege the tragedy may have been avoided altogether. Their lawsuit also accused the Parker's company of negligence for not properly training the employee to verify customer ages during alcohol purchases. Parker and his attorneys argued against the lawsuit. They were pretty adamant against this for a long, long time, claiming along the way that they bore no responsibility for the decisions of Mallory Beach or any other of the boat crash victims for staying on a boat with Paul Murdoch, who they all knew at the time was too drunk to drive, and they had multiple opportunities to get off the boat. So for a long time, Parkers were saying, "Hey, maybe our employee made a mistake. It shouldn't matter because they knew and testified, or well, I shouldn't say testified. They said after the fact to police that they knew Paul was drunk and too drunk to drive the boat. He kind of muscled his way into the position, saying it was his family's boat and he should be driving it. And but they had opportunities to get off the boat because the boat did make some stops, including at a bar that night as well. So that was their argument. But ultimately, I guess they felt settlement was going to be their best case if it went to trial. So, $15 million settlement that again was leaked from someone somewhere, as Parker's attorneys claim that these details were not supposed to get out. But you know, I didn't really look into too many details in how negligent this cashier was at Parker's, as far as not checking the IDs properly, or were they just not trained right? And when you have the Murdoch family, really the quote unquote big bad in this scenario, the ones that, you know, enabled Paul's behaviors and then tried to allegedly manipulate things behind the scenes so Paul wouldn't get in trouble. You don't really think about the bar that served, alcohol to some of these kids, or Parker's necessarily. So it's not something that you think about as much as the bigger stories that were grabbing the headlines, and also, of course, the subsequent double murder. But it is good, if anything good can come out of the situation, to see some level of accountability for anyone that was involved and contributed. Again, I haven't really looked at the Parker side of things too in depth, so I'm not going to give too much of an opinion. But of course, it's nice to see the Beach family get something out of this horrific situation. Money's not going to bring their daughter back, of course, and who knows how much of that money they'll see, and et cetera, et cetera. But it is a win for them, and they need one for sure, considering what they've been through. Speaking of murder cases in South Carolina, there was another relatively high profile one, nowhere near the level of the Murdoch murders, of course. But in Lexington County, there was a recent trial involving a man named Greg Leone, who was a successful restaurant owner in that county, and he had established a popular chain of Mexican restaurants. Well, he was on trial and was ultimately convicted earlier this month of murdering his wife's lover. To add another level to this, just a few days after he was found guilty of murder, he ended up dying at a Columbia hospital after becoming ill. He died this past Friday night. The news was announced in a tweet by Eric Bland, who is an attorney. He's also a longtime friend of the deceased. At the time, and from what I've seen, no cause of death has still been given, though, however. At the time of his death, Leon was 56 years old and had been an inmate in the South Carolina Department of Corrections. And he was just starting to serve the first weeks of what was going to be ultimately a 30-year prison sentence. The corrections agency really hasn't made an official announcement or provided any other details about what happened either. So we'll have to wait and see what the cause of death was determined, whenever the autopsy is completed. Leon started the San Jose Mexican chain of Midlands restaurants. So all his restaurants are located in the Midlands, and he was convicted back on July 6th of murdering 28-year-old Arturo Bravo Santos on Valentine's Day 2016. He was sentenced to those 30 years in prison on the murder charge, and actually had another 5 years on the sentence for possession of a weapon during a violent crime. The sentences were going to be served concurrently, so in total it was supposed to be a 30-year sentence. Bravo Santos was killed after Leon followed his wife to a park and ride in Lexington County on that Valentine's Day 2016. There, Leon found Bravo Santos with Leon's wife in the back seat of a pickup truck and ended up shooting and killing the 28-year-old man. For a while there, the defense was that it was a self-defense situation, that Leon felt threatened and thought maybe Bravo Santos was reaching for a gun, but ultimately they decided that no, this was a case of murder and not self-defense. But yeah, just similar to the Murdaugh trial, and not again, nowhere near as high profile, but someone who was known in that community. And there was some headlines, especially in papers in that area of the state, about this, and frequently was in the news. So it was probably a much bigger deal in that part of the state, whereas Murdoch was nationwide, not just a section of the state. And just surprising that just a handful of days after being convicted, he dies. And so, of course, people are wondering, okay, did he do this to himself? Did someone do something to him? Was it just a coincidence, some health thing? So we'll find out what happened, but certainly an interesting twist to a case that seemed to be over. Now we've got a couple stories about fugitives. Just weird how the news sometimes does this with similar stories. The first one has to do with Gerard Price, who you may have heard of. For 77 days after the South Carolina Supreme Court ordered his arrest, fugitive, a convicted killer, Gerard Price was roaming the country, and he just seemed to always be one step ahead of the FBI and the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, aka SLED. Around April 26, when the Supreme Court ordered him taken into custody, Price, who is 43 years old, was in the state of South Carolina. This, according to a law enforcement document that the state newspaper obtained. However, once he was ordered back to prison, he just completely vanished. However, that multi-week manhunt officially ended on Wednesday morning of last week. So last Wednesday, a week ago today, when Price was taken back into custody by the FBI and the New York City Police Department after he was found at an apartment complex in the Bronx. He was ultimately found after a tip was given to the South Carolina Department of Corrections, and then that was forwarded to the FBI, and they ultimately were able to find him based on that tip. So, ever since mid April, when First Circuit Solicitor David Pascoe disclosed to local media that Price had been released after serving only 19 years of a 35-year mandatory prison sentence, that we started to really learn about the situation. And obviously, the family of the victim that Price murdered was completely upset and taken aback by this, that someone who they thought was going to be in prison for 35 years was out after 19. So, just FYI, Pascoe, the Circuit solicitor who brought this to the media's attention, had actually prosecuted Price back in 2013 and won that murder conviction against him. So why was he out early? It turned out Price was released under a secret court deal between a now retired state judge by the name of Casey Manning, and Fifth Circuit solicitor Brian Gibson, and Price's lawyer, who is also a state representative, Todd Rutherford. Manning's order allowed Price to get out of prison 16 years early. So in 2003, Price, who was a member of the Bloods gang, was convicted of murdering a college football player in a Columbia nightclub and was sentenced to that 35-year mandatory sentence. So that's the crime he committed. And how exactly did he get out early? Well, to engineer Price getting out of prison, Representative Rutherford, who I mentioned was his attorney, and Fifth Circuit Solicitor Gibson used a little known procedure to persuade the judge, Manning, who's again is now retired, to issue a court order. So there's this procedure that allows for a judge to take time off of an inmate's sentence if the inmate has helped law enforcement inside the prison. And Rutherford argued that Price had done that on several occasions. So it doesn't say what exactly he did to help law enforcement inside prison. Are they talking about like snitching, basically, like giving them information to help prevent crimes within the prison, or maybe saying, oh, I overheard this guy talking about his case. Here's what he said about it, and trying to get that in the hands of the prosecutor. It doesn't say, but you can imagine it might have been something along those lines. So they convinced Manning to issue the court order, which let Price get out early on this procedure. And no one really knew too much about it. But in April, when it became known that Manning had secretly knocked off half of Price's sentence, Attorney General Alan Wilson successfully petitioned the state Supreme Court to void the order and mandate that Price be put back in prison to finish out his sentence. So from Price's perspective, you got to imagine like, whoa, man, what the heck? You're in prison. You're supposed to be there for a certain amount of time. You find out you may get out. A judge agrees, and you get out early, and then you just find out a little while later, no, you're gonna have to come back. Like, I can't imagine going through that. And don't get me wrong, no real sympathy for the man since he was convicted of murder. So, but just thinking about that for a second is interesting to me. To think you're getting out of prison, you actually do get out, and then are ordered back to it. So, no surprise that he ran. Who wants to go back to prison, of course? But thankfully, he has been located after that whole order has been voided. But the story's not going to be done, I'm sure. So he's since been brought back to South Carolina since he was found in New York, and will be going back to prison. But I guarantee there's going to be lots of questions, and maybe some more. I don't know, of investigation if it'll get that high, but looking into this whole situation and how it got there, where a murderer was let out of prison so early. So I'd be surprised if this is the last we hear about this entire situation. I mentioned we have multiple stories about fugitives, so let's move to the next one. You may remember that Pennsylvania man who was a murder suspect and led police on a multi-day manhunt here in the South Carolina, well, in South Carolina, period, but specifically, he was ultimately found, I believe, in it was Berkeley County. And it was just a wild story. He was on the run due to some crimes he had committed in other states. I believe he was wanted on murder in New York. He had kidnapped a couple on his way south and forced them to drive him to South Carolina. And he was ultimately caught. He was then brought back to prison in Pennsylvania. And then you may remember, I believe it was last week, maybe 2 weeks ago now at this point, he had escaped from the prison. So we're talking about Michael Burham, who is 34 years old. He fled from Warren County Prison, which again is in Pennsylvania, shortly before midnight on July 6th. Um, he ultimately used some equipment in the gym, as well as some tied up bed sheets, and escaped, and wasn't able to be found immediately, and has been on the run for multiple days. Obviously, this led to an urgent multi-agency search in Pennsylvania and beyond. At a press conference this past weekend, specifically on Saturday, Warren County Lieutenant Colonel George Bivens said that Burham was caught by cops at approximately 6 p.m. after he was spotted in the woods by an elderly couple who went to investigate what their dog was barking at. Law enforcement descended on the forest near Warren, Pennsylvania, after hearing about the sighting through a tip line. They then used tracker dogs to help locate the fugitive deep in the woods. A Warren County official added, when they were speaking to CNN, that they are preparing an isolation cell for the inmate, but they plan to move him from the prison by Sunday, and that is what ultimately happened. However, they have not said where he would be moved to. So, just another wild and bizarre story. It was already a wild one with the initial escape. Well, I guess escape might not be the right word, but if he was on the run from bail, whatever it was, when he was here in South Carolina, they find him. That was already a crazy story, because of the kidnapping as well and the crimes he was accused of. And then he ends up escaping from prison and was on the run again, and just a crazy story. So again, although different than the first story in terms of this person escaped, wasn't let out of jail, it's a good ending where he has been found. As far as we know so far, no one has been harmed by him since he escaped. So that's good news that he, didn't, whether it was kidnapping or worse, nothing like that appears to have happened this time around, and he is back in prison, where he very likely belongs. I have to say very likely because he has not been convicted of anything yet. So, the whole allegedly thing is in play here. That'll do it for this edition of Holy City Center Radio, but I will be back on Friday. You don't want to miss that show. We've got some interesting things to talk about, including we have an update on South Carolina's first congressional district. Remember, it was determined on the state level that that district had been gerrymandered along racial lines in an effort to dilute the black vote. Well, it was appealed by Republicans who drew the new district lines for the most recent election, and it's up to the Supreme Court. Well, we have an update on what the Supreme Court, when they plan on hearing about this case. We also have plenty of other stories, so be sure to check back in on Friday. Best way to do that is to subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you're listening on. That also helps me get, helps them say, hey, a lot of people are subscribing. That old algorithm will then try to put my podcast in other people's ears. So be sure to do that if you haven't already. Also, a very helpful thing you can do is like, subscribe, rate, review, anything else involving the podcast on whichever platform you're listening on will be a big help. You can also go an extra step and go to holycitycenter.com/shop to pick up some fun merchandise, or go to patreon.com/holycitycenter where you can sign up for a support tier. Before I go, a big thank you to Cole Collins with LMC Sound System for producing this episode, as well as a thank you to Tyler Boone, whose music you hear in each and every episode of Holy City Center Radio. And lastly, and of course, even though I probably already said it a couple of times, thank you so much for listening. I really, really appreciate it. It means a lot to me that you all are interested in this podcast and what I thought would be a nice change where I update you on local stories multiple times a week versus just one time a week. I really appreciate people supporting the change in the format and the kind words I hear. So thank you so much. Can't wait to talk to you on Friday, just a couple days away. But until then, good night and good luck.